Thanks. Eronon, thank you firstly for the SPRI and the Basque government for inviting me to be here today. I hope I can tell you more about South Africa as a place to invest, and especially about what there is to do and how to approach your investment decision. My presentation today might sound somewhat pessimistic, and it's true that the current moment feels like a very unpredictable and difficult one in my country, but there are wonderful opportunities in South Africa precisely because so many very important things are undone, and we need companies to come in and help us do them. So I want to start by talking about the most important problem that we have in South Africa, which is the inequality and exclusion that we inherited from the apartheid government. Almost all our other problems flow from this one central original problem, and this is a very important thing to understand about South Africa. You can essentially talk about two South Africas. There's a very poor country which is almost entirely black, and then there's a fairly well-off, by African standards anyway, country which is quite diverse but tends to be very white. An enormous number of people are locked out of the formal economy, and those people are almost all black. They have very little prospects of obtaining formal full-time employment, and that whole economy can be said to depend on social grants and help from the state. In 2015, we had almost 17 million grant recipients. Now, this is on a population of 55 million. We had more than 11 million people living on what we call extreme poverty, of under 355 rand a month, which is 21 euros, which I suppose must sound like desperate poverty in Europe. And even the what we call just poverty, at a new poverty line of 779 rand a month, that was almost 30 million people. Now, inequality is getting better, but only slowly. Now, these are some figures from the Reserve Bank's expenditure surveys in 2011 and 2006, where you can see that the black incomes are improving very fast, but it's still off a very low base. With a black household is still only a fifth on average annual income of a white household. And what you don't see in this, because we're talking about averages, is that the richest white people have continued to get richer because of increases in asset prices, especially stock prices, and less well-off white families have got poorer. And this adds to volatility and tension in the political environment, as these poorer white people then blame the government and highlight very legitimate concerns about corruption to tell their stories in a certain way. But also in the category of the black people, that the rise in incomes does tend to be driven to a large extent by rapid income rises from a small number of very rich households. An important part of the story is education. Most schools in South Africa are really bad, and the poor people who go to those schools have very little prospect of using education to improve their prospects. Some people do, but then those tend to be really exceptional people. By and large, the schools aren't good enough. So these charts show how the picture has changed. The educational qualifications that white people and black people aged over 20 had in 1996, 2001, and 2011. And as you can see, even in 2011, over 60% of adult black people did not have matric, which is our school leaver certificate, compared to barely 20% of white people. And also a far greater proportion of white people come in that yellow category there, people with higher educational qualifications, which obviously those increasingly, as the world gets more complicated, you need a higher qualification to get on. So this, of course, only entrenches the existing inequalities. These are the living standards measurements which the advertising industry in South Africa draws up to place you in a certain kind of spending category. And the comparison of the LSMs in 1994 and 2014 shows us that the direction of travel is positive, in that the rich part of society is becoming more diverse. In 1994, over 80% of the richest tranche of society was white. In 2014, it was 51%. And you can see that if you go, especially in Johannesburg, if you go to the more expensive shopping centers, the crowd that you see is more racially diverse than it was, and that is a good thing. But at the bottom of the economy, as you can see, the picture hasn't changed. The poorest people in South Africa are almost all black. So this is obviously and rightly a constraint on policy making, because there's a very big mass of people who don't have the services, that don't have the opportunities that they need. And in the political sphere, more recently, owing to how long it's taken for government to show improvement in these areas, it's given rise to a new political current on the left that's putting pressure on policy making. And this is going to be more relevant going forward. Just to relate this to how bus companies ought to think about coming to South Africa, if you want to sell into the developed side of the economy, there is money, there are opportunities. You will face some competition because it is a sophisticated market in a lot of ways, but it's not Europe, and I think bus companies, especially in newer sectors like biotech or energy saving or the green economy more broadly, we'll find things here to do, as the example of Iberdrola, of course, shows. There are also opportunities in services, especially, I think there's quite an exciting sector of companies set up to operate in South Africa and sell services to the developed world. We've already done very well there in advertising and filmmaking. And I expect to see more development of high-end business services that companies come to South Africa to set up to sell to developed markets. And that's incidentally the story of my company, NKC. We were bought over by a British company because we're just as good as them, but they don't have to pay us as much. If you want to sell to the population more broadly, I think it's a good idea to go to the States, because the state is stretched in a lot of ways. The opportunities here are in housing and power and transport. And then I expect to see more, because of the urgency of providing services to all these people, I expect to see a greater rollout of public-private partnerships. We've already seen a few that have worked. One is the Gautrain, is a metro rail initiative in the north of the country. Another, of course, is the Independent Power Producer Program, where Iberdrola has done really well. And last week, Lynn Brown, our Minister of Public Enterprises, publicly called on Transnet, our transport parastatal, to make more aggressive use of PPPs in order to make a more efficient use of our rail and harbour networks. So I think that's exciting and something that can lead to real opportunities going forward. The slowness, I just want to talk a bit about our recent history since democracy, because that explains where we are now. When we became a democracy in 1994, the ANC, of course, was elected to replace the apartheid government, but also to rectify the injustices that we were sitting with in the early 1990s. And as we've seen, that's happening far too slowly for people to be satisfied. Now, the reasons for that are pretty complicated, but if I have to summarize them, it's because under President Nelson Mandela, there was a focus on reconciliation, firstly, on avoiding a war, which is something that I can remember people were talking about a lot, and on retaining white expertise, because the exile movement came back home, and they didn't necessarily have the skills to run quite a big country. Then under President Thabo Mbeki, his focus was very strongly on improving public finances, because the apartheid government left us with a terrible debt overhang, and under President Mbeki, they tightened spending to such an extent that we actually ran budget surpluses for 2 years under his presidency. But of course, this prudence came at the cost of rolling out services to the poor, and this disaffection by the poorer part of the population, as well as more left-leaning elements in the ANC and the trade unions. The trade unions are actually part of a governing coalition with the ANC, made it possible for Jacob Zuma to push out Mr. Mbeki as party president in 2007, and then get elected as a state president in 2009. Now, Mr. Zuma has been bad news for the country, and most of our important dynamics in the political economy now come from that. There had always been corruption in the South African states, most especially when it came to big tenders and especially arms deals, but it has got worse on his watch. One of the biggest problems is at state-owned enterprises, SOEs, and the biggest, I want to say, cost center there is SAA, the South African Airlines, which we've had to bail out to the tune of over 11 billion rand, or almost 700 million euros in 6 years. Then there are concerns about a power deal with the Russians, where it seems pretty clear that because of personal considerations given to the president and some of his friends, that deal is going to go ahead at a massive cost to the treasury. People are talking about 1 trillion rand, which is a quarter of GDP. There are concerns about the Guptas, an Indian family that have very unhealthily close relationship with the president, and there have been worrying instances of ministers, flying to Switzerland to make sure they get a coal deal with Eskom. And then there was Nkandla, which is something that if you read about South Africa, you'll see a lot, but it's not that serious in terms of money. The president basically used $20 million of public money to build himself a house. And while that isn't a big part of our budget, people talk about it a lot. In our country, of course, where a lot of people live in leaky shacks, for the president to spend that much money on his own home is a political talking point. Now, in order for these people to keep doing what they've been doing, they have made a concerted effort to degrade and damage the institutions of state. The most serious damage has come at SARS, was our tax authority, and the National Prosecuting Authority, which there's been a political effort to weaken the NPA because it was investigating corruption charges against the president personally. And now this is translated into problems for governance more broadly, since it's because of the tax authorities weaken, so now it's easier for rich people to avoid their tax obligations, and detectives are overburdened and the court system is overburdened. So we heard earlier about the efficiency of the legal system in the US and in Germany. It's not like that in South Africa at all. Now, these things came to a head to some degree in December. And I just want to dwell on this story because what's happening now and what's going to happen over the next year and a half are all informed by something that happened in December, when on December 9, Mr. Zuma fired Nhlanhla Nene, our Minister of Finance, almost certainly because he was opposed to a deal at SAA that would have allowed the chairman of SAA, who is a personal friend of the president's, to lease planes from Airbus in a complicated way that made it possible for someone to make money out of it. And he was also opposed to the Russian nuclear power deal, and that would have played a role as well. And he was replaced with a complete unknown there in the middle on the left, Des van Rooyen, who was known to be a Gupta man. And also it happened in a very strange way. It was at sort of 7 o'clock in the evening, people started sending each other SMSs. It wasn't made during office hours in the form of a statement from the presidency. So markets then panicked. The rand fell 7% in minutes during the evening, while the markets weren't actually open in South Africa. Bond yields gapped up. They went up 150 basis points. And the stock exchange lost 2.9% in 2 days, from the Wednesday to the Friday. The banking index fell by much more because people were, and still are, afraid of a ratings downgrade. And if that happens, then the banking sector is going to be most exposed. So then on the Sunday, again, in a very odd way, on the Sunday afternoon, the president reappointed Pravin Gordhan. And that was well, no one knows exactly what happened, but except the people involved. But the various stories all involved some combination of very senior figures in the ANC telling the president that this was a step too far, that he had to roll it back, fix the mess, or else they would walk out of the party. So that's what he did by reappointing Mr. Gordon, who had been his finance minister in his previous cabinet. But now the big question now is, how genuine is this? What is the power relation between Mr. Gordon and the president? How much will he be allowed to do? And so that's basically what we're sitting with now, is that there's these aren't really two factions. The people on the right are definitely one faction. That is the group of people around the president who have been using the state to enrich themselves and who have been degrading institutions of state to keep getting away with it. On the other side are people with very different ideological and economic views about the country, but who are sort of loosely united in opposition to the corruption and the theft. And it looks as though that union is becoming more tighter and more, that is becoming more of a real movement. And also business and civil society are tending to work increasingly with Mr. Gordon in particular, who's been meeting with a lot of business people and flying all over the world. He was in America and the UK now in these past weeks to speak to business people and reassure them. So that's really what we're looking at now, is every day in the newspapers, everyone in South Africa is looking for news to see what can happen. And now in the past week, actually, since I made this presentation, there's been some sort of concerning news in that Special Investigation Unit has been sent after Mr. Gordon to ask him about a team that he set up at SARS. So really the central question at the moment is how strong are these two factions? And this is very important for our political economy, especially as we're going into a period of some political volatility. We're having municipal elections in August. So the ANC is challenged. It risks losing its majority in 3 metropolitan regions. If it does badly, and it looks as though the president and his scandals were the cause of that, then that will further weaken the president's political capital. Some people have even talked about the possibility that he might not finish his term. I don't think that is possible, because I don't think the ANC can afford to do this to 2 presidents in a row, because that's how Mr. Mbeki left office. So what I'm hoping for is some sort of succession, because the ANC chooses its party president in 2017, and the ANC is definitely going to win the national election in 2019. So the person who becomes ANC president next year is going to be our state president probably for 10 years, from 2019 to 2029. This has important policy implications. So it sounds as though the president wants his ex-wife, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, who is currently with the African Union, to take over. An alternative is Cyril Ramaphosa, the deputy president, who has good relations with business. All of this is all important to watch. If you read the South African press at the moment, most of what you hear or read is going to be about a ratings downgrade, about the possibility that either Standard & Poor's or Fitch, who now have us on BBB minus, are going to downgrade us to BB+, which is sub-investment grade on that scale, what people call junk. So the bad news is that at NKC we think this is likely. Mr. Gordon gave his budget speech in February, but he wasn't able to make it clear. He chose not to increase taxes in order not to break the economy. But this also means that economists, including us and including the people at the ratings agencies, don't see how he will be able to limit the deficit to 3.9%, as he said he would. Especially as growth, which this is the Treasury's forecast at 0.9%, is too low to raise taxes, and some capital flight last year also means that the tax base has shrunk. The main question is also of Mr. Gordon's relative political capital, not only to stop misspending and theft at the SOEs, and on tenders, especially at a municipal level. That's where we lose a lot of money, is tenders going wrong. But also public sector wage increases, seeing it as it is an election year and the trade unions have a very strong voice in government. It's not clear that he will be able to limit the wage increases in that sector. The good news is that that downgrade has already been priced into a large degree, especially in the second half of last year and especially in December. With all this finance minister drama, we saw a lot of capital flow out of the country, mostly in the form of managed assets, as more cautious asset managers took their money out of the country, and rich South Africans did the same. And the yields went up as well as those people sold off bonds. So at the moment, we're already paying higher yields. That is the spread between treasuries and US treasuries. So our spread's already higher than that of Turkey or Russia, who both have the BB+ rating that we will have after a downgrade. We're not paying as much as Brazil yet, but they have some particular problems of their own. So we tend to think that the effects of a downgrade won't be very dramatic, but that also depends on how it happens. If it's only on fiscal things, then that's one thing. But if the president manages, for example, to push Mr. Gordon out of office, then that will be very bad news. And then sentiment will tend to have an impact, especially on the currency and on yields. So the main effect of I'm going to call it the anticipation of the downgrade has been through the currency. The rand fell very badly in H1. Well, for the whole of 2015, really, but especially in H2, and especially in December. It's pulled back a bit. If you look at purchasing power parity indices, like the Economist Big Mac Index, the rand is one of the most undervalued currencies in the world. But for sentiment reasons, we don't think it's going to pull back very much. So we expect it to stay there unless there is some kind of thing that makes it clear that the foxes are in charge of the hen house and corruption is going to get worse. An important factor in our economy this year, possibly more important than the downgrade, is a terrible drought. In 2015, the maize output was down 30% year on year over the previous year. It's going to be even worse in 2016 because large parts of the country were going to harvest at the end of the summer, which has just passed, and they couldn't. That has a small effect on the trade balance, but a much bigger effect on the economy through inflation, through the price of food. Inflation is heading up. It's the blue line there on the top left slide, heading up quite sharply. In January, it was 6.2% year on year from 5.2% in December. And this means it's over the Reserve Bank's target band. They wanted to keep it under 6%. The Reserve Bank publishes different inflation numbers for different consumption categories, and it was worse for poor people, naturally, than rich people because a greater part of their consumption basket is in food. Even more worrying than that was the effect on producer prices that we saw in January, as maize as an input into food production was up 20% year on year, and as an input into the agricultural sector was up almost 80%. So that means that farmers have had to pay more for grain. Essentially the food consumers and the farmers are competing for the same grains to sow and eat respectively. So that's going to keep going up. Our next inflation print comes out next week, and we're expecting it to be quite a bit higher than 6.2%. Now, our Reserve Bank is extremely focused on inflation. It's got a very clear inflation target. So in response to the increase in inflation, it's already raised rates by almost 2% since January last year. We expect another 50 basis points in 2016, and we expect the rate to go to 8% by 2018. This is going to have effect on consumers. We have high debt levels. They might not sound high to Europeans, but in South Africa, a debt level of 80% of disposable income is quite high, given the inequalities and the lack of job security that we have. So this is going to add to the long-term stagnation in the business environment. But I've only got 3 minutes left, so let me talk about what this means for bus companies and prospective bus companies that want to invest in South Africa. So firstly, the weak rand means that it would be a good idea to focus on exports. You can establish production in South Africa to sell to developing countries, or sell services, or otherwise, if you're selling machines, as I know a lot of bus companies are, then think about your clients as the South African companies who are already doing this. Think about phone systems, think about machines for people who manufacture in South Africa and ship abroad. High inflation numbers mean you can't count on consumer demand. You want to be looking for inelastic basic plays where demand remains high. Otherwise, you want to offer South African producers ways to decrease their costs if you can sell them machines that are more reliable than the ones we're buying from China. Otherwise, you can think about state spending, about finding ways to help the state to provide services to poorer people. Or else you can focus on the very luxury market, which amazingly never goes away. Every time results come out, corporate results, then there's a specific retailer, Woolworths in South Africa, that's a very expensive supermarket. They just keep doing better. High interest rates mean you want to think about capital sources. It's probably best, it'll be most effective if you can bring equity capital, or even if you can raise capital here in euros and bring it to South Africa, that will work out better. Conversely, if your business model involves getting your working capital needs from South African banks on short-term lines, then be careful about the size of those needs and also prepare for higher interest rates in the future. And if it's at all possible to fix your rates in advance, then do that. Fiscal constraints mean that you might want to help the state, look into PPPs and logistics. You can come to the state with a good idea. They're often at the more, I want to say, practical level, very receptive to ideas. It does sometimes happen that these ideas run into obstacles further up, but it's always worth a try. And also prepare for higher taxes on the richer parts of the economy. Prepare for higher income taxes, prepare for higher corporate taxes. Prepare for funny taxes on things that look like they are consumed in more by the richer sectors of the population. And then unemployment issues means create jobs, especially if you can create semi-skilled factory work. Then there are some initiatives in South Africa that the government will help you with. Just to end, I just want to quote one of our more admirable liberal politicians who said, optimism is an intellectual choice. So I remain determinedly optimistic about South Africa because I think the gangsters have taken it too far. And that there will be a pushback by patriotic and responsible people within the ANC and within government. I expect corruption and service delivery to improve, maybe not right now, but at some point in the medium term. I do expect policy to keep moving to the left, which might complicate the business environment somewhat, but that is an urgent and necessary shift. We need to help our poor people and improve their living conditions. And if you can help us do that, then you will be welcomed in South Africa by government and by the private sector, and your business will prosper. Right. I think we're going to touch on some of these themes now in the round table.
That's right.
Yes.
Thank you.